USS North Carolina had a hole 30 feet long below her waterline. Seawater was rushing into her compartments, pushing her into a list. Around her, USS Wasp was burning, and USS O'Brien was fighting to stay afloat. 3 ships struck by the same torpedo spread on September 15, 1942. North Carolina had been built for a different fight entirely. 9 16-inch guns, 2,700-pound shells, a fire control system precise enough to track a target over the horizon and account for the rotation of the Earth itself. She was the most powerful surface combatant the United States had launched in 16 years, a giant ship killer. Now, as the sole survivor of the surrounding massacre, North Carolina was to become something very different. Not America's biggest weapon, but America's greatest shield. On October 27, 1937, at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, workers set the keel of USS North Carolina. It was the first new battleship the U.S. had laid down in 16 years. For more than a decade, the Washington and London naval treaties had kept American battleship construction on a short leash. Limits on size and numbers slowed the pace of new construction to a crawl. Meanwhile, around the world, not everyone was following the same rules. Reports of larger hulls and heavier guns kept arriving, and each one made it harder to pretend the gap was closing on its own. So with North Carolina, the Navy was trying to break out of the constraints and catch up before the next war arrived. Armor, speed, and firepower competed for the same space. She had to fit through the Panama Canal, which set her maximum width and shaped the hull from the start. As the ship moved toward completion, the Navy paid close attention to what Japan might be building. Reports warned it was building battleships larger than anything afloat. The Navy responded by tearing up the original plan and redesigning North Carolina. Now, it brandished 3 triple turrets, turning the ship into a platform built on raw force. A full salvo meant 9 of them leaving the barrels within seconds, enough to make the entire hull shudder. These guns were meant to break armor at long range and explode inside what they struck. Making room for them forced changes in balance, internal layout, and protection. When North Carolina went to sea for trials, the consequences of those compromises became apparent. At certain speeds, the interaction between the propellers and the hull produced a violent vibration. The shaking ran through the ship's structure, rattling equipment and making the ship difficult to operate as intended. So the Navy sent her back to the yard to have new propellers installed. She went out again, hit the same speeds, and the vibration returned. North Carolina became a familiar sight along the New York waterfront, sliding past the city on another trial, then turning around for more work. Crowds started to gather just to watch her go by. They called her the showboat because she kept appearing again and again. Eventually, the problem was reduced enough for the Navy to accept the ship. By then, the war in Europe was already underway. She was the lead ship of her class, built alongside her sister ship, Washington, and the first of a group of fast battleships that would join the fleet during World War II. North Carolina entered service through constant drills meant to prepare the crew for a surface engagement. Her 16-inch guns were powerful, but they were only as effective as the crews behind them. In plotting rooms, teams kept the target's bearing, speed, and range updated. Those numbers fed an analog fire control computer that predicted the target's position as the shells arrived, accounting for wind, barrel wear, ship motion, course changes, and even the Coriolis effect. Below decks, the armored barbette dropped toward the keel, linking the guns to handling rooms and magazines, where the 2,700-pound shells and powder were lifted by hoists, guided into their loading path, and rammed home by hydraulics. In action, one mount demanded roughly 177 sailors. Across 3 turrets, that was nearly 600 men, close to a third of the crew, tied to making the 16-inch guns fire on command. As the men were getting used to the ship, war arrived at America's doorstep. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Battleships sat trapped at anchor as torpedoes struck the waterline, while bombs fell onto the decks built to fight other ships, not airplanes. The surface duel the Navy had prepared for began to slip away, and ships like North Carolina found their missions narrowing. Still, with North Carolina being so new, the Navy wasn't ready to treat her as a background ship. In the spring of 1942, the Navy sent her north to the cold waters around Newfoundland, standing ready in case the German battleship Tirpitz broke into the Atlantic convoy routes. Every routine on the ship ran with the same assumption that a real surface fight would arrive without warning. but the enemy never came. The men were trained for a moment that they could not force into existence. In July, North Carolina left the Atlantic and sailed for the Pacific. When she arrived at Pearl Harbor on July 11, 1942, the mood changed immediately. The fleet was still living in the shadow of the December attack, where they had lost ships, men, and any sense of safety. For those who remained, North Carolina was a sight to behold. She was a modern battleship coming in under her own power, ready to join them in the fight. Sailors on nearby ships cheered as she entered the harbor. On the docks, men stopped what they were doing just to watch her come alongside. The screams of joy as she moved through were overwhelming. Inside the ship, one of her crewmen later admitted the cheering felt strange because they had not done anything yet, had not fired a single shot in combat. At that moment, North Carolina's crew promised themselves that they'd make sure their ship would earn that praise soon. They didn't have to wait too long. Within weeks, North Carolina was operating with Task Force 61 around the carrier USS Enterprise. In the Pacific, carriers such as Enterprise were used to deliver the damage, but they could not absorb it. Everything else in the formation existed to keep aircraft from reaching the flight deck. Destroyers and cruisers formed the outer ring. North Carolina took her place, close enough to fire into the approach lanes and tear attacks apart before they hit the center. On August 24, 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the first radar warning came in. Contacts appeared, then multiplied. The scream tightened as the first wave began its run. North Carolina's 5-inch dual-purpose guns opened first. They were firing into the air, building a ceiling of bursts between the attackers and Enterprise. Mixed into that fire were proximity-fused rounds, a weapon treated as secret even inside the fleet. The shells carried a small radar device in the nose, and they were detonated when they passed close enough to an aircraft. Many of the men loading the guns didn't know why some rounds were suddenly so effective. They only saw enemy planes flying into the air that erupted around them. The flak was thick enough that observers thought the battleship had been hit and set on fire. Japanese pilots still forced their way in, their bombs falling close enough to throw shock through the hull, and strafing cut across the ship's topside. Unfortunately, one sailor was lost. Despite this, crews kept firing through smoke and concussion. The attack lasted only around 9 minutes. When the aircraft broke off, Enterprise was still afloat at the center of the screen. North Carolina had fired her first shots in combat, and they were fired to keep someone else alive. Barely a month after her first real fight, on September 15th, North Carolina was operating with the carrier force south of Guadalcanal, guarding the ships that were launching airstrikes and covering the island campaign. The formation steamed through open water with destroyers screening ahead, but the ocean below still belonged to submarines. One of them was the Japanese submarine I-19. From periscope depth, the submarine tracked the American ships as they crossed its sights. When the moment came, the crew fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One of them struck North Carolina. The explosion hit the port side below the waterline and tore open the hull. The blast forced the battleship into a 5.5-degree list to port as thousands of tons of water rushed into the damaged compartments. 5 sailors lost their lives in the explosion and the flooding that followed. Damage control teams reacted immediately by slamming shut watertight doors while pumps forced water back toward the sea. Other crews deliberately flooded compartments on the opposite side of the ship to counter the weight of the incoming water. In that moment, every valve and bulkhead held the ship's fate. While that happened, the same torpedo spread continued across the formation. Several of the weapons struck the carrier USS Wasp, which quickly became an inferno as burning fuel and exploding ammunition spread fires across the ship. That night, Wasp had to be scuttled. Another torpedo struck the destroyer USS O'Brien. She remained afloat and managed to withdraw, but the damage weakened her structure. Weeks later, while attempting to reach repairs, the ship finally broke apart and sank. Meanwhile, I-19 got away after the attack and continued operating afterward. North Carolina stayed afloat, eventually managed to remain afloat under her own power. Still, the torpedo had torn a massive wound in her hull. This forced North Carolina out of the fight and back to Pearl Harbor. The Navy used this need for repairs to reshape the battleship to suit the war actually being fought. Older anti-aircraft weapons came off the deck. The unreliable 1.1-inch mounts were removed and replaced with quad 40mm Bofors guns. Banks of 20mm Ehrlichins followed, covering the ship with short-range fire meant to break up attacking aircraft. Radar equipment expanded as well. Air search and surface search radars were added alongside fire control sets, giving earlier warning and better tracking in poor visibility. Those contacts fed into a centralized radar plot, which the Navy would later formalize as the Combat Information Center. Our officers tracked aircraft and coordinated gun assignments. When she sailed again, the ship carried more guns aimed upward than outward. North Carolina knew the next threats would come out of the sky, and she'd been rebuilt to meet them head-on. By late 1943, she joined the fast carrier forces as the American advance pushed west across the Central Pacific. The next step was the Gilberts and Marshalls, a chain of small Pacific atolls that Japan had turned into fortified bases. Many of the islands were narrow strips of coral, but the defenders had spent months turning them into gun positions by cutting firing pits into the coral and pouring concrete bunkers along the shoreline. One of the strongest of these positions was Betio, the main island of Tarawa Atoll. The garrison there included about 2,636 Japanese troops. Carrier aircraft could crater runways and hit ships, and they could pick off exposed positions, but they could not sit over Tarawa long enough to break down the bunkers. Those strong points had to be hit until they stopped answering, which meant naval guns hammering them again and again. In November, North Carolina supported the Tarawa landings from the covering force. From offshore, the atoll looked like a thin strip of land, barely above the waterline. When the order came down, her main battery answered at once. 9 16-inch shells hit in quick sequence, walking across the assigned area. Each impact punched up coral and wreckage and rolled smoke over the positions that had been firing a moment before. The fall of each salvo was tracked from above by observation aircraft, often OS-2U Kingfishers, circling over the target. They watched the bursts land and immediately radioed corrections back to the ships firing offshore. As the Marines formed up to cross the lagoon, the bombardment kept pressing. North Carolina stayed on the line and kept firing, working to crush the weapons that could sweep the water and tear into landing craft at close range. The campaign did not pause at Tarawa. In January 1944, North Carolina moved into the Marshall Islands at Kwajalein and Roy Namur, where the Japanese garrison was about 5,000 and 3,000 respectively. Off Roy Namur, North Carolina opened her bombardment before sunset and then kept firing through the night. This time, her shells started fires on shore. The ship used those fires as reference points to keep the shots aligned and the salvos moving across the defended positions instead of drifting into empty coral. A month later, the American advance had reached the point where the fleet could strike one of Japan's strongest bases in the Central Pacific via Truk Lagoon, which had served for years as a staging ground for Japanese naval forces. Warships, cargo vessels, fuel depots, and airfields crowded the islands around the lagoon. If it remained intact, it could threaten every step of the American push west. The operation to break it open was codenamed Operation Hailstone, and carrier aircraft led the attack. Before dawn on February 17th, waves of American planes lifted from their decks and flew toward the lagoon. More than 500 planes formed the strike. Their targets were ships anchored inside the harbor and aircraft on the ground. As soon as the first bombs hit, the lagoon erupted in smoke and burning fuel. North Carolina moved with the carrier task force as the attack unfolded. Her position was on the perimeter of the operation, guarding the ships that launched the strike. As aircraft departed and returned, her radar teams kept sweeping for anything climbing out of Truk to hit the task force. While aircraft hammered the base from above, Japanese ships tried to escape the harbor, only to run into aircraft already circling overhead. Bombs and torpedoes struck them as they reached open water. The strike continued through the day and into the next. By the time the raid ended, about 40 Japanese ships had been sunk, including the cruiser Katori. Roughly 200 aircraft had also been destroyed. But above all, around 250,000 tons of shipping lay burning or sunk inside the lagoon. Truk had been one of Japan's strongest naval bases in the Pacific. After Operation Hailstone, it was no longer capable of supporting major fleet operations. When the American task force turned away, North Carolina remained inside the moving wall of protection. In June, the American fleet had pushed deep enough into the Pacific that the next step was the Mariana Islands. Capturing Saipan and the surrounding bases would place American airfields within striking distance of Japan itself. The Japanese Navy understood the stakes and to stop the invasion, it committed its main carrier striking force to strike the American task forces covering the landings. The fleets met in open water off the Marianas. The first blows came from American flight decks. The strike groups launched in steady succession. Japanese carriers answered by sending their own waves toward the invasion forces off the Marianas. North Carolina held station in the carrier screen, close enough to the carriers that her 5-inch batteries could reach into the approach lanes. Her radar picked up the first returns, while the attackers were still distant. More blips stacked onto the scopes as the formations closed, turning scattered contacts into a single advancing picture. When the first aircraft broke into view, tracers rose and bursts bloomed ahead of the incoming planes. American fighters hit first and broke the incoming groups apart. The aircraft that kept coming met the next barrier as the screen opened fire together. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers together fired timed bursts into the lanes leading to the carriers. North Carolina's 5-inch batteries built the first ceiling. As aircraft dropped lower, the 40mm guns took over. Then the 20mm mounts filled the gaps at the last few thousand yards. Smoke, spray, and nearby detonations kept cutting across sightlines, but the mounts kept swinging. Japanese aircraft were hit from multiple directions at once. Torpedo planes that needed a straight, level run found themselves under continuous fire, making straight flight impossible. Bombs released early hit water instead of decks. The sea beneath the fleet became a graveyard of aircraft fragments. Some hit the water intact and then vanished in a quick explosion of fuel and spray. Others skipped once, broke apart, and left floating wreckage behind them. By the end of the fight, the Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft and the trained air crews that made them dangerous. The imbalance was so stark that American pilots gave it a name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. North Carolina herself was credited with the destruction of 2 aircraft. In December, while the ships maneuvered to refuel at sea, the barometer began to fall and the wind started to rise. Forecasting and storm tracking were still unreliable, and the fleet's information didn't match what was building around them. The ships kept steaming until the weather closed over them. Only later would it be clear that they'd sailed directly into a full typhoon. Gusts of wind drove walls of water across the decks, collapsing any sort of visibility with spray. Waves hit like moving walls. The ocean became ridges and valleys. The ships were left climbing one wall of water, only to plunge down the other side, while the formation that had been carefully organized for battle scattered in the storm. In the case of North Carolina, the bow climbed the swells and then dropped hard enough to shutter the hull. The deck rolled underfoot as water swept exposed positions and ripped loose anything that hadn't been secured. At times, she rolled more than 30 degrees. With every turn of the rudder, it became harder and harder to drive the ship. Below decks, the engineers fought to keep the ship answering the helm. Outside the battleship, the storm was already claiming ships. Destroyers caught in the worst of the seas rolled too far and never recovered. Hull, Monaghan, and Spence capsized and vanished beneath the waves. Hundreds of sailors were lost with them. The storm scattered the fleet across hundreds of miles. Aircraft broke free on carrier decks. Antennas and topside gear were damaged, and unsecured equipment slammed and skidded across the ships as they rolled. Some mounts and fittings came back bent or torn. On North Carolina, even 20mm gun shields were folded by the force of the sea. When the wind finally began to fall, the formation that had entered the storm no longer existed. North Carolina was still afloat and still moving under her own power as the weather slid away. As the seas settled, the scattered ships began to find each other again. Before continuing their journey, they scanned the swells for life rafts and hauled survivors from the water wherever they could. Come late March of 1945, the American fleet was operating off Okinawa, the last barrier before Japan itself. The island lay close enough to the Japanese home islands that aircraft could finally reach the fleet in large numbers. However, by this stage of the war, Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots and much of its carrier fleet. Commanders turned to special attack units, kamikaze pilots, ordered to crash their aircraft directly into American ships in hopes of breaking the invasion fleet. As a result, the ships off Okinawa fought under constant alert, and every signal meant another incoming strike. Fighters launched to intercept them, but many aircraft slipped through and came in low over the water. When aircraft pushed closer, North Carolina's Beaufort mounts picked them up and hammered streams of shells into the sky. The guns fired for hours until the mounts' metal grew hot, and the smell of burned powder hung over the ship. On April 6th, one of those attacks drove directly at the formation. North Carolina's directors picked up a single aircraft, cutting in toward the screen. The 5-inch mounts swung and began firing. As it kept coming, the Beaufort mounts joined in. Even under that fire, the kamikaze drove straight through the approach lane and tore past North Carolina's starboard side. It missed the ship by seconds. The attacker hit the water almost alongside the hull and detonated in a blast. Close by, a destroyer on North Carolina's flank had been shooting at the same aircraft. It kept shooting, even as the target crossed behind the battleship. One of its 5-inch shells reached North Carolina. It struck the battleship's 5-inch director, which erupted in flames. 3 sailors lost their lives on the spot. Below, the 5-inch crews were now pushing through smoke and jagged metal to reach the shattered director, dragging the wounded clear, while others fought the small fires starting around the wreck. Backup stations took over what they could. Despite the damage, ammunition still rose through the hoists, and the Beauforts kept firing whenever a target crossed their sights. The ship did not peel out of formation. In fact, North Carolina kept station off Okinawa and stayed in the carrier screen, while the kamikaze campaign surged. April 6th itself was a mass day of attacks, featuring about 182 kamikazes in 22 groups hitting the Allied ships offshore. She was credited with shooting down 3 kamikazes, then later shooting down additional attackers during the Okinawa operations. After surviving the brutal months off Okinawa, the fast carrier fleet turned north and carried the war directly to the Japanese home islands. In July, the fleet began sustained attacks against Honshu. Carrier aircraft lifted off in large formations and crossed the coastline to hit airfields, factories, rail yards, and shipping along the Japanese coast. Each launch left the carriers temporarily exposed, while their decks were full of fuel, bombs, and returning aircraft. During those moments, the ships guarding them mattered most. The counterattacks they expected rarely came. Japan's remaining air strength had been worn down across the previous year of fighting, and many of the aircraft that did appear were intercepted far from the carriers. For the first time in the war, North Carolina finally used her main battery against Japan itself, firing on industrial targets in the Hitachi area on Honshu during the fleet's home island bombardments. The operations continued through the summer until Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. Just as suddenly, the carrier strike stopped, and the fleet stood down from combat operations. In 1947, the Navy decommissioned North Carolina and moved the battleship into the reserve fleet. For years, she remained there while the Navy reorganized around aircraft carriers, submarines, and guided missiles. Eventually, her name was removed from the Naval Vessel Register, which meant she'd be sold to a scrapyard where cutting torches would dismantle the hull piece by piece. Instead, the decision moved to the people whose state name the ship carried on her bow. Citizens across North Carolina organized a statewide campaign to save her, raising $250,000 to buy the battleship from the federal government. Tugboats hauled her up the Cape Fear River and eased her into Wilmington. She became a memorial museum. Across the war, North Carolina was credited with 24 confirmed aircraft victories. She'd been built for a surface duel, but she'd finished the war without ever firing in an enemy battleship.